Welcome to the traveling exhibit. I'm Kanji Sahara, project director. I am a camp survivor from Jerome and Rover. This is about Tuna Canyon Detention Station, which was located about 14 miles north of downtown Los Angeles, that was originally built as a civilian conservation corps camp in the 1930s. On December 7, 1941, when the Japanese military bombed Pearl Harbor, the FBI and other law enforcement officials started arresting Japanese, German, and Italian aliens in Hawaii and on the U.S. mainland. Because of agreements with the U.S. government, seizure of Japanese, German, and Italian nationals in Latin America also began, and these would eventually involve 18 Latin American countries. On that same day, the camp was taken over by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the process began to convert it to a detention station. In Southern California, many arrested aliens were taken to local jails and then to detention stations such as Tuna Canyon and San Pedro. After being processed, most were sent to confinement sites in places like Missoula, Montana, Bismarck, North Dakota, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. U.S. involvement in World War II produced casualties, not only overseas in the battle zones, but also at home. A tragic abuse of civil and human rights was perpetrated against people of Japanese, German, and Italian ancestry in the U.S. and Latin America. For them, the detention internment system devised in the years leading up to World War II and implemented rapidly after the Imperial Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor would be a painful demonstration that civil rights can be easily lost. The Tuna Canyon Detention Station was first step along the road to learning that lesson. What was Tuna Canyon Detention Station? After the outbreak of the war, and for several years thereafter, many arrested Japanese, German, and Italians were sent to Tuna Canyon before being transferred to other confinement sites. Enemy aliens were also subject to contrabands, curfew, travel, and other restrictions. What started as arrest eventually led to the gates of Tuna Canyon Detention Station for over 2,000 enemy aliens. The Immigration and Naturalization Service commandeered the CCC camp on December 7, 1941. 10-foot-high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, floodlights, guard towers, and a lookout tower on the northern ridge were added. The first prisoners entered the camp on December 16, 1941. The detainees were primarily Japanese, German, and Italian aliens from Southern California and Japanese from Peru. The Tuna Canyon Detention Station was in operation until the end of 1943. In October 1943, during its existence, it processed over 2,000 enemy aliens, a majority of whom were Japanese. The camp consisted of 7 barracks, 1 infirmary, 1 mess hall, 1 administration building, and 1 office building. One of the barracks was a recreation building which included a library from the CCC camp. The building was also used for Christian and Buddhist services and movies. Each barrack had an internee captain. The Japanese supplied their own cooks and took care of cooking, serving, and cleanup at the mess hall. The guards ate the same food in the same mess hall. The internees maintained the grounds, including the garden where they grew vegetables for the kitchen. The infirmary was staffed by a local Tohunga doctor who was on call. Most of the time, there was a Japanese doctor being held at the camp who was preferred by the Japanese men. Wednesday and Sunday were visitation days. Regulations required internees to stand 10 feet from the fence, but their families could approach the fence. The rule was that only English could be spoken. Most Issei spoke very little English, so communicating was often stressful. One Issei wife, so stressed that she blurted out words in Japanese, quickly found a bayonet against her throat. Amongst this turmoil, there was one individual who went out of his way to make things easier.
My name is Kei Oda. I was born at Poston concentration camp. Merrill Scott was appointed the first officer in charge of Tuna Canyon in December of 1941. He oversaw the conversion of the camp to a detention facility. Scott showed a deep respect and understanding for the prisoners in his care. Who was at Tuna Canyon Detention Station? Young Heigoro Endo was 15 when he left Shizuoka Ken in 1900 and came to the United States. He worked on fishing boats sailing from Terminal Island and then as a captain of his own tuna boat based at Wilmington. Later, he started a pioneering sports fishing business at White Point in San Pedro. At the outbreak of World War II, the U.S. government considered Issei fishermen to be a danger to the security of the Pacific coast. Heigoro faced additional suspicions because of his affiliation with Compton Gakuen, a well-known Japanese language school. On March 30th, 1942, Heigoro's family was given an order by the Army to leave their homes within 6 days as part of the mass incarceration of West Coast Japanese. But 2 days later, he was suddenly arrested by the FBI without a warrant and detained at Tuna Canyon. At his hearing, Heigoro was not allowed to have legal counsel. The government made numerous false accusations about his complicity with the enemy. He was presumed guilty unless he could prove his innocence. Heigoro was later incarcerated with his family at Santa Anita and Jerome.
My name is Sigrid Banzhoff Toy. My father was at Tuna Canyon Detention Center. In 1933, Fritz Kaspari was one of only 2 students from Germany to win a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University. A strong opponent of Hitler, Kaspari spent the war years in what he called voluntary political exile in the United States, where he taught German and history at Scripps College in Southern California. The day after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Kaspari was arrested with the charge against him summarized as German sympathies. Detained in San Pedro, he was released in February of 1942, but arrested again in September and detained at Tuna Canyon. It was during this time that the acclaimed violinist Yehudi Menuhin wrote to Fritz offering to play at Tuna Canyon, although it's not certain that this ever took place. At Tuna Canyon, Fritz became the mess officer and tried to ensure that everyone could obtain decent food in line with their cultural preferences. Paroled in 1943, Kaspari returned to Germany in 1954 as a member of the German Foreign Service. He served as counselor at the German Embassy in London, the deputy chief of the German mission to the United Nations, and later as the German ambassador to Portugal. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth in 1972 and is remembered as Professor Sir Fritz Kaspari. When Cesare Rene Grimaldi was 25, he left his native Rome and emigrated to the United States. The year was 1928, and Benito Mussolini's tyranny was growing. College educated with an ability to speak 5 languages, he was admitted to the United States legally under an immigration quota and secured a position with the Italian Consul General. While working for the consulate in Los Angeles, he met California-born Corinne Ross Harris. They were married on July 26, 1938. Attracted by the emerging Hollywood film industry, Cesare left the Consul General and became a personal assistant to a movie director. On December 8, 1941, FBI agents arrested Grimaldi, leaving his wife Corinne and 6-month-old son Gian to fend for themselves. Transferred from one internment facility to the other, Grimaldi wound up at Tuna Canyon Detention Center. By the time he was released in October 1943, he had spent almost 2 years in confinement. In 1927, Dr. Eugene Banzhoff, a PhD in civil engineering, came to America from Germany as a sales representative for a German company. In 1929, Emmy Arendt, his bride-to-be, arrived. Los Angeles was their home, where their only child, a daughter, was born in 1937. The couple applied for U.S. citizenship. On the night of December 7, 1941, Eugene was apprehended at his home by the FBI with no explanation as to where he would be taken, his whereabouts unannounced for 3 weeks. Eugene's arrest left his wife and daughter without support, as all of his business and bank accounts had been frozen by the government. Emmy found it impossible to find work, targeted at the time as a Nazi German, a term used to refer to those of German descent. As fear gripped the nation, she was spat upon and marginalized. Spitting upon a German was considered a patriotic gesture. As a result of Emmy's experiences, occasional hospitalization due to fragile mental health were necessary, forcing her to abandon her child to be housed with strangers. After his arrest, Eugene was placed in the Terminal Island Correctional Facility and later confined at Tuna Canyon Detention Center and Stringtown, Oklahoma, before his release after over 2 years of confinement.
My name is Nancy Teramura Hayata. My father was at Tule Lake Segregation Center, and my mother was at Manzanar. Reverend Daisho Tana was first interned in Tuna Canyon and then Lordsburg and Santa Fe, New Mexico. His diary discusses the concept of Bukyo Tozen. It brings tears to my eyes to think of the profound words, the eastward transmission of Buddhism. As I reflect on the fact that Buddhists on the Pacific Coast have carried the Buddha all the way here to a place where we can see the Rocky Mountains as we celebrate the birth of the Buddha. While it may be true that the Buddhist organizations on the Pacific Coast have been decimated, the Buddha seeds that we now have flown on the winds of this war will eventually move eastward and take root themselves before flowering into authentic Dharma flowers. 25-year-old Kishiro Hayashi was arrested because as a factory and store manager, his name was on the blacklist. He and 100 Japanese men were taken from jail and driven by truck out of the city. With destination and fate unknown and separated from his pregnant wife, Mr. Hayashi stated, "I have no word to describe this utterly cruel treatment." 3 days later, they arrived at a harbor. Mr. Hayashi recalled, "American soldiers with bayonets urged us to move to the ship as if we were some animals." The military cargo ship set sail to Panama. Finally, it was clear that we were not going to be sent to the remote area in Peru, but were being sent to the U.S. On board ship from Panama to the U.S., I was assigned to clean up the deck, but sometimes we were mistreated by a mean soldier who kept yelling at us, "Hurry up! Hurry up!" and continuously poured hot water from behind us. Nikuma Tanoe was born in 1886 in Kumamoto, Japan. He completed high school, then came to America in 1903 and took up truck farming in Torrance, California. He was a kendo instructor as well. In 1918, Momoe Uemura came from Japan to become his wife. They had 5 children who excelled in school. During World War II, Nikuma registered for the draft and was willing to serve for his adopted country. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The next day, Tanoe's eldest son, Ted, was inducted into the Army. The following night, Tanoe's world completely fell apart. In a midnight raid, the FBI kicked open the door of his home, raided the house, and arrested him. This brought great shame to the family. He was interned in Tuna Canyon Detention Station because he taught kendo. During World War II, Nikuma's eldest son Ted was killed in action in Italy. Sergeant Tanoe received the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously in the year 2000. During the Korean War, Nikuma's youngest son Yukiwo was also killed in action. Another son, Isao, also fighting in Korea, accompanied his brother home and then returned to the front line to continue fighting for his country.
My name is June Aochi Burke, and I am an 87-year-old survivor of Rower, Arkansas relocation concentration camp, one of America's 10 concentration camps operated by the War Relocation Authority during World War II. What was it like to be an enemy alien? Long-held anti-Japanese sentiment, exacerbated by fear and suspicion, triggered actions against persons of Japanese ancestry. During the early months of the war, many Issei community leaders, including priests, ministers, heads of community organizations, journalists, Japanese language teachers, businessmen, and fishermen, were picked up by the FBI and other law enforcement agents, pursuant to Presidential Proclamation 2525. Many individuals were initially held in local jails or similar facilities before being transferred to places like the Tuna Canyon Detention Station. Most would later be sent to Department of Justice and Army internment camps. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, allowing the military to exclude or restrict any person from designated military areas without due process for reasons of military necessity. In the ensuing months, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, two-thirds of them American-born U.S. citizens, were herded into detention centers and later incarcerated in 10 War Relocation Authority concentration camps. Most lost their homes, their treasured personal belongings, pets, jobs, and livelihoods. Many Issei imprisoned in Department of Justice camps or army camps were later released to join their families in these concentration camps. Families were also transferred from the WRA camps to the Department of Justice camp at Crystal City, Texas. Over 1,500 Issei and their Nisei children were used in the 2 hostage exchanges for U.S. citizens held by Japan during the war. After years of hard-fought litigation, legislative efforts, and public education and mobilization, the Japanese American community and its supporters secured the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. The U.S. government then issued a public apology and acknowledgement, individual apology letters, monetary compensation, and established a public education fund as redress for the civil liberties violations resulting from the government's wartime policies. This redress was restricted to former prisoners who were U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents of Japanese ancestry and alive on the date when the legislation was passed. Events unfolded quickly for Germans living in the United States following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. Within hours of the bombing on December 7, 1941, the FBI and other law enforcement authorities arrested hundreds of German immigrants. On December 8th, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Presidential Proclamation 2526. Over 300,000 German immigrants were labeled as enemy aliens. 3 days later, on December 11th, the U.S. declared war against Germany. Thousands of German immigrants were arrested in subsequent months. About 140 Germans from the Southern California area were among those imprisoned at Tuna Canyon Detention Station. By the end of the war, at least 11,000 German immigrants and their families, including U.S.-born children, were interned in Department of Justice and U.S. Army camps in Texas, in Florida, Oklahoma, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Some children were left to fend for themselves or placed in orphanages when their parents were arrested and taken away. Executive Order 9066, issued on February 19, 1942, authorized the Secretary of War to establish military areas which led to the mass expulsion of all Germans, Italians, and Japanese aliens from designated prohibited zones, 88 of which were in California. This caused traumatic family separation and economic hardship. The Western Defense Command's proposal to remove millions of German and Italian enemy aliens from all military areas, including those on the East Coast, was thwarted by the U.S. President due to the possible negative impact on the war effort. In response, the U.S. Army began an individual exclusion program and issued several hundred orders to expel selected naturalized citizens of German and Italian descent from military areas. During the war, there were at least 15 exchanges of over 2,650 German enemy aliens and their U.S.-born family members for U.S. citizens held in Germany. The exchange families in Germany now faced hunger, forced labor, Nazi persecution, and Allied bombing as they struggled to survive. Former internees of German ancestry in the U.S. and from Latin America, their families and supporters continue to educate the public about U.S. wartime policies that led to the internment, repatriation, and exchange of civilians of German ethnicity so as to better protect the civil liberties of future vulnerable ethnic groups. To date, the U.S. government has not redressed the civil rights violations endured by the German Americans and Latin American communities during World War II.
My name is Claudia Rizzo Culling. I'm a Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition board member. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, immediately affected the Italian American community, as the FBI and other law enforcement officials descended on homes and businesses to arrest hundreds of Italian community leaders without charges, trials, or explanations to family members. On December 8, Presidential Proclamation 2527 was signed, turning all Italian immigrants, more than 600,000, into enemy aliens. On December 11th, the U.S. declared war on Italy, and arrests of Italians in America continued. Specifically targeted were journalists, leaders of community organizations, language school teachers, and World War I veterans. After arrest, the enemy aliens were soon detained in facilities operated by the Immigration and Naturalization Service. During its existence, Tuna Canyon Detention Station held over 100 Italian aliens, most from Southern California. All arrested enemy aliens eventually had hearings before civilian boards. During the hearings, aliens were not allowed to have attorneys, question witnesses, examine any evidence, or have the right to appeal. Recommendations were delivered to the U.S. Attorney General for final decisions, either unconditional release, parole, or internment. Many Italians were issued orders for internment in camps located in the South, tearing apart families. Italians endured special registration restrictions that were imposed on all enemy aliens. These included being required to carry enemy alien identification certificates, handing over personal property deemed contraband, staying within a 5-mile radius of home, obeying a curfew from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. daily applied on the West Coast, and surviving with frozen bank accounts. Italian as well as Japanese fishermen had their fishing boats seized by the government, which devastated livelihoods. As authorized under Executive Order 9066, the mass exclusion of enemy aliens from prohibited zones included 10,000 Italians living in California, many of whom were elderly women. These individuals were forcibly separated from their families, homes, and businesses with less than 1 month's notice. In October 1942, restrictions were lifted on Italian aliens. Factors in this decision may have included concern for the Italian-American vote in upcoming congressional elections, their support for the war effort as the U.S. prepared to invade Italy, and complaints from Italian-American troops about the treatment of their parents. Policies for Italian excludees and internees remained in place until the armistice with Italy in September 1943. By that time, over 1,800 Italians had been interned, and at least 37 were shipped to Europe in hostage exchanges. In 2000, U.S. Congress passed the Wartime Violation of Italian American Civil Liberties Act. As ordered by the Act, in November 2001, the U.S. Attorney General submitted a report to Congress called A Review of the Restrictions on Persons of Italian Ancestry During World War II. Despite this report, the U.S. government has not granted an apology or redress to former internees of Italian ancestry.
My name is Nancy Kyoko Oda from the Tule Lake Segregation Center. The existence of Japanese Germans and Italians residing throughout Latin America posed a predicament for the United States, which was concerned about possible Nazi infiltration and the danger that this might pose for Western Hemispheric security. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government initiated the seizure and deportation of approximately 6,600 men, women, and children of Japanese, German, and Italian descent from 13 Central and South American countries and 2 Caribbean nations. Ship transport to the United States was arduous. Visas were not issued, and identity papers and the passengers' passports were confiscated. These individuals were labeled illegal aliens and considered potentially dangerous. One ship, the USAT Puebla, docked in San Pedro, California on February 10, 1943, with 316 men, women, and children aboard. Some 207 of them were processed in Tuna Canyon Detention Station. After Japan's surrender in September 1945, the U.S. government authorized the forced deportation of 1,400 enemy aliens of Japanese ancestry to Japan. More than 300 Japanese Peruvians fought deportation and were paroled out of the camp sponsored by Japanese American relatives, churches, and/or economic guarantors as cheap labor. About 100 Japanese Peruvians were permitted to return to Peru. Meanwhile, about 1,000 persons of Japanese ancestry petitioned to return to their homes in Latin America. Several years passed before the remaining internees would be released and allowed to return to their former countries of residence. The Refugee Act of 1953 was amended to allow Latin American internees remaining in the United States to apply to change their illegal alien status to legal permanent residence. Many became American citizens. As part of the settlement of the Mochizuki versus United States of America court case, the United States publicly acknowledged that the government action had wrongfully interned individuals from Latin America during World War II and granted $5,000 in reparations to each person of Japanese ancestry deemed eligible for the payment. However, the controversial redress action did not extend to German, Jewish, and Italian internees. The U.S. government has yet to officially apologize for its wartime actions that resulted in denying rights to internees from Latin America. We thank our many sponsors, the National Park Service, Japanese American Confinement Sites, and the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimage for their support.
Hello, this is Chris Tashima. I am going to take you on a virtual tour of the Tuna Canyon Detention Station. Tuna Canyon is about 14 miles north of downtown Los Angeles. It is located between Pasadena and the San Fernando Valley in the city of Los Angeles. Tuna Canyon was a civilian Conservation Corps camp built in 1933. During the Great Depression, the young men in the CCC camps built roads and campgrounds, fought forest fires, and planted trees, and in return would learn a trade and receive spending money to send back home to their families. Even before December 7, 1941, Tuna Canyon was on a government list of sites to become a temporary detention station in the event of war. It was where enemy aliens from Southern California were going to be processed before being sent to long-term internment camps such as Crystal City, Texas, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Fort Missoula, Montana. In 1939, the FBI created a Custodial Detention Index. The Custodial Detention Index had an ABC list, a list of potentially dangerous enemy aliens. Individuals in Category A were supposed to be the most dangerous spies and saboteurs. People on the ABC list were already under surveillance before the war. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Within hours, the FBI started arresting enemy aliens on the ABC list. The next day, the Immigration and Naturalization Service took over Tuna Canyon. They built a 10-foot-tall cyclone fence topped with strands of barbed wire around the perimeter of the CCC camp. They installed floodlights and erected guard posts. Executive Order 9066, which was signed on February 19, 1942, incarcerated 110,000 Japanese people, both aliens and U.S. citizens, in concentration camps. Tuna Canyon was different. Japanese, German, and Italian aliens lived in the same barracks. They started arriving at Tuna Canyon on December 16, 1941, 2 months before EO 9066 was signed. On the mainland, the government had a two-tier system for the incarceration of the Japanese people. One system was composed of the temporary detention centers, such as Santa Anita and Tanforan, plus the 10 WRA concentration camps, such as Manzanar and Heart Mountain. This is where 110,000 Japanese people were held. The other system was composed of temporary detention stations, such as Tuna Canyon and Angel Island, and the long-term camps such as Crystal City and Santa Fe. This is where 15,000 Japanese, Germans, and Italian aliens were interned. The people on the ABC list were supposed to be, quote, dangerous people, but they were actually community leaders. They were the businessmen, Japanese language school principals, kendo instructors, newspaper publishers, and Buddhist and Shinto priests. The detainees slept in 4 dormitory-style barracks. The total capacity of Tuna Canyon was 300 men. There was the mess hall, library, recreation room, education building, workshop, barber shop, and other facilities. Whenever the capacity of 300 men was reached, the 300 detainees were sent on a special train to long-term internment camps, such as Missoula, Montana. On Wednesday and Sunday was visitation day. Detainees had to stand 10 feet back from the fence. Relatives and friends could stand right next to the fence. Only English could be spoken. One day, an Issei wife spoke Japanese and quickly found a bayonet at her throat. The curfew law stated that the Japanese had to stay within 5 miles of their homes. This meant that Japanese families in Orange County had to break the curfew law to visit their fathers in Tuna Canyon. With a father going to Montana and the family going to a place called Santa Anita, families did not know when they would see each other again. It was a time of uncertainty, fear, and despair. On one visitation day, more than 1,000 people came. Thank you for joining me on this virtual tour of Tuna Canyon Detention Station. It has been 75 years since Tuna Canyon detained, quote, dangerous Japanese. During World War II, no Japanese was accused, tried, or convicted of spying or sabotaging for Japan against the United States. There was no reason to imprison 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry during World War II.